Number one, the first thing that sabotages our humility is that we put something other than Jesus Christ on the cross at the center of our self-assessments. A little backstory on how I came upon this research. My mom, she had me when she was 14 years old, very young. And I'm not going to give you the whole Hallmark movie story, but just know that it was really hard for her because she was so young. She didn't even have a junior high education. And she didn't have a partner, so it was just me and Mom. And she worked so many long hours, and she worked so hard for me to give me the best life that she could. But she was gone a lot. And so I had to sort of kind of figure out life for the most part on my own. We kind of grew up together, Mom and I. And I had to kind of figure out life a lot on my own, and I was very ambitious in this pursuit. I really wanted to figure out, how do you live, and how do you make the most out of life, and what's the right way to be? And I was like a little social scientist where I'd watch people. Why do they do that? Why do they do that? And for the most part, I did some good things in that process, but at some point I came to this kind of philosophical crisis, this psychological distress, because I came to this point in my journey where I couldn't decide if I should view myself as fundamentally bad or fundamentally good. Because I was saved in this church, this was in junior high, I was saved in this church in Egan about 30 years ago. And there were these believers at this church who really pushed this idea that people are, everybody, me and you, we're all fundamentally bad. There's nothing good in us. And even when it looks like I'm doing something good, there's some sinful motive that's motivating it. And that's just how absolutely, utterly depraved we are. And they wouldn't like come up to me and say, "You're terrible, you can't do anything good." That'd be a terrifying church if they did that. But this belief system sort of squeaked out in other parts of their ministry. Like we would be in a prayer circle and somebody would be praying and they would say, "Lord, I am just totally despicably wicked and unworthy of your love." And I would like open my eye like, "Do you really think that?" And I would look around and people would be nodding and whispering amens. And I just couldn't accept that. I couldn't accept such a deplorable view of myself. And it was probably simplistic reasons why, because, you've seen this yourself. They had these paintings on their walls, and they had their children's books with all these pictures of Jesus. And you've seen these pictures with Jesus with the movie star hair, and somehow perfect teeth, and a little giddy kid on his shoulder, and parents in the background, all jolly and happy. And none of these people in this picture looked like they viewed themselves as despicably wicked. They all seemed pretty okay with themselves. And Jesus didn't treat them like they were despicably wicked. Why should I look at myself like that? It just didn't seem to add up to me. Plus, I tell you, this church treated me with such dignity and gave me so much love. Whatever is good about me right now is largely due to the love that those people gave me back then. And that's like my first taste of Christian community. So they weren't really living out this belief that we're just all so terrible. They lived a different way than what they proclaimed. Plus, this is in the early 90s, and the self-esteem movement was all over the place. And I would go to school every day, and you would hear these mantras: "You are wonderful, you are great, you are special." Instead of thinking of myself as bad, they wanted me to think of myself as great. "You're awesome." And I couldn't really accept that either, because it didn't seem to be based on anything. It was just this fabricated out of air, "You're awesome." And I remember there was a poster even. I don't remember who the athlete was, but some hotshot athlete pointing out, like this. And it says underneath, "You are special." And even as a kid, I realized, well, how does he know that I'm special? He doesn't know me. But the assumption, of course, is that everybody is special. But then that ruins the whole point of what special is. If we're all that, then we're not special. I couldn't accept that. And so that was my dilemma. Which one is true? It didn't seem like they could both be true, and it didn't seem like there was any other options. And here's the other thing, too, is they sort of become each other's nemesis, because the farther you go in the ditch of smallness, the more and more you hate yourself, the more and more smaller you view yourself, and the more you inevitably lead to shame. Because the enemy of the ditch of smallness is pride. Because if I really am fundamentally bad, pride is a feeling of being fundamentally good or superior. And so you have to get away from pride as far as possible, and so ultimately you're going to end up in shame, which happens to be the enemy of the ditch of bigness, because the ditch of bigness says that you are fundamentally good, and shame is a feeling of being fundamentally bad. So shame is the enemy that we must fight with self-esteem and positive thinking. And they puff you up all the way to the point where you become arrogant, which is the enemy of the ditch of smallness. And here's the other baffling part of this, is that there's really smart people in both of these camps arguing about the spiritual risks and the spiritual flaws of the other ditch. And they both seem right about the other one being wrong. And whenever two sides are right about the other one being wrong, they both must be wrong somehow. It has to be. There has to be another option. I think the answer is Jesus' teaching on humility is the third way. It's the way out. But here's the problem. If you ask anybody in either of these ditches, hey, do you think that humility is important? They will affirm that with great vigor and passion. Absolutely, humility is important. It might even be the most important thing there is. The problem, though, is how they understand humility emerges from the conceptual presuppositions of their ditch. It comes out with all of the pre-workings of their ditch. And so it comes out looking very different than the humility that Jesus teaches in Matthew 23. I realized this when I was in college, back at Bethel, like Greg said. It wasn't in his class, though. It was in Professor Herzog's Life and Teachings of Jesus class. And I just remember this so much because he was, how he did it is he would give out these little scraps with a word on it. And whatever word that you were given, that's what you had to write your final paper on. And I remember he was walking around handing out these scraps, and I was thinking, oh, please, give me atonement. Give me atonement. No. Sanctification. Oh, that'd be great. No. Covenant. That's the one I really want. Give me covenant. Give me covenant. And I got my little piece of paper, and I opened it up. Humility. So boring. And I asked, hey, you want to trade with me? And these Bible students are ruthless. They had no interest in trading for humility. So I was stuck with studying humility. And so how I usually study a topic, anything that I research, I usually start with how other Christians think about it. And what I found was other Christians all kind of agreed that humility is roughly the opposite of pride, is how they would say. Humility is the opposite of pride. And it looks something like this. And when you look at that, that seems pretty intuitive. Humility is the opposite of pride. It seems right because as hard as I try, I can't imagine a person who is both prideful and humble. I can't do it. And so there's something that seems right about that. But the more you think about it, the more I think you'll find that there's also something wrong with it. The more you think about it, I think you'll start to see the ditch of smallness with its fingers in there as well. Because if humility is the opposite of pride, and if pride is big and pro-self and full of bluster, and if humility is the opposite, then humility has to be small and anti-self. And the more humble you become, the smaller and the more anti-self you have to become. And so there's this incredible downward pressure that gets put on us as we try to get more and more humble. And one pastor in, I don't want to say his name because he's a really good writer, but on this point, we disagree on this, but he says this: in the Christian life, the way up is down, he said. And so that downwardness is just baked into how we should pursue humility. And this leads to sort of a farcical competition for downwardness. If you read people, like if you go to a party and you say, hey man, I caught a fish, it was this big, people will try to one-up you. Oh yeah, well I caught a fish, it was this big. But you read these people and it's like they're trying to one-down each other. It's like, I am just loathsome. I am a pulsating ulcer. I am a bleeding wound. Just like all these, I am a burp trapped in the fool's throat. Just like all these terrible, I can't, man, it's such a buzzkill reading. It's like such a bummer. Humility is literally a total downer. I thought that would be funnier. Hold on. Okay. So humility is a downer, and it's no wonder that we don't see this humility in our critical engagements in society, because by definition it wants to be ineffective. Of course, I'm just miserable, I'm worthless, I can't do anything. Well, you're not going to help us then. You're not going to do any good then if you start off with the presupposition that you can't do any good. Then I moved to what Jesus said in Matthew 23. And I read Matthew 23, and I felt like my heart roared when I read this, because Jesus provides this alternative to the two ditches that is so powerful and liberating. And I want to set it up a little bit. Now, he's in front of the Pharisees here, but he's talking to the crowds and to his disciples, and he's using the Pharisees as sort of a prop to make his point. He's about to talk to the Pharisees, starting in verse 13, after this section. And he's about to open a can of you-know-what on these guys, because this is like his most aggressive assessment of the Pharisees. It's called the 7 woes in a lot of Bibles. But he starts with the foundation of their problem before he goes into the 7 woes. The foundation of their problem was that they lacked humility. And so in these 12 verses, I think he gives his most robust understanding of what humility is like. And I'm going to read it, and then we'll kind of break it down a little bit. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to the disciples, "The teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they sit in Moses' seat. So you have to be careful to do everything they tell you to do, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to help. Everything that they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide." What the heck is a phylactery? We'll come back to that. "And the tassels on their garments long. They love," I lost my spot. "They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master, and you are all brothers and sisters. And do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." Now, there's a lot of stuff here. I wrote a whole book on it, and I can only talk about one thing. So the first thing that jumped out at me right away is that the ditch of smallness is wrong. Humility cannot be the opposite of pride, the way the ditch of smallness says. And you can see this in verses 8 and 9 of what I just read. "You are not to be called rabbi, and do not call anyone on earth Father." Now, it's not the titles that Jesus cares about, because he uses Father and Rabbi and teacher all over the place. In fact, even at the beginning of this passage, he refers to the teachers of the law. He doesn't care about us using CEO and coach. That's not what he cares about. What he cares about is the exaltation that we take from it, the puffing up of having the title. That's what he's going after here. Because he says, do not let anyone call you rabbi. Don't exalt yourself over others. He's agreeing with the ditch of smallness. Pride is bad. We have to stop exalting ourselves over others. That's spiritually dangerous. But then he turns the ditch of smallness on its head. He just blows the whole thing up, because he says the opposite of that is also bad. And so it can't be humility then. He says, don't put anybody above you either. Don't call anyone on earth Father. Don't exalt others. Jesus is saying that both being exalted and exalting others and feeling inferior to others, they're all flawed. There's something wrong with all of them. So Jesus' understanding of humility will look something more like this. Humility is contrary to both shame and pride. Now, this is a little abstract, and something that was really helpful for me was James Kellenberger has a metaphor or an analogy on pacifism. You can think of pacifism as the opposite of winning a war. But you could also think of pacifism as the opposite of losing a war. But you wouldn't say that pacifism was somehow a balance between winning a war and losing a war. That would be silly. Pacifism is against the whole war thing itself. Pacifism is against anything having to do with war. In the same way, humility is the opposite of whatever it is that creates shame and pride, which we're going to talk about in a minute. What this means, a few things right away. That our intuition that both ditches must be wrong, absolutely. Because if humility is contrary to both shame and pride, then anything that leads to shame and pride must be somehow contrary to humility. And since the ditch of smallness inevitably leads to shame, and the ditch of bigness inevitably leads to pride, there must be something fundamentally flawed in both of them. The second thing is that humility neutralizes both shame and pride. The more humility you have, the less shame and pride you should have in your life. Which also means, inversely, if you feel superior to others, there's something in you that's lacking humility. There's something wrong about how you're assessing yourself. But also, if you're feeling inferior to others, there's something wrong with how you're viewing yourself. Both are flawed. Both reflect something wrong with your spirit. It also means that not all humility means tearing people down. Sometimes to humble yourself, you need to be built up. And doesn't that make sense? Don't you see people who are just like, they're so self-loathing, they hate themselves so much? The ditch of smallness would celebrate that. You're doing good. But no, it doesn't feel right. There's something wrong about that. These people need to be built up, not to be torn down more. Hey, thanks for watching that sermon clip. That was from a sermon I did at Woodland Hills Church last March. It's been over a year already. I can't believe it's been that fast. That was such an honor to do that sermon. I've been a part of that community for decades, and that was my first sermon there. And what a great honor. Thanks for being a part of it. Thanks for watching it. If you want to watch the rest, I'll leave a link down below somewhere. I don't know where, but I'll leave a link down there. And if that message moved you at all, or if it inspired you and you want to learn more about that, that was basically part of my book, Confident Humility, Becoming Your Full Self Without Becoming Full of Yourself. So check that out. And if you like these little sermon clips, please consider, or I should say as a Christian, prayerfully consider clicking the follow button. and like the video if you liked it. And I hope to see you soon.